Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about how to create a sense of form in space. In other words, how to shape space with color. In the last three modules, we've been looking at how color creates a strong sense of light through the use of value, hue, intensity, and temperature. Today we're going to begin looking at how color creates a sense of form and space. And we're going to define first what form and space are. Then we're going to look at how you can use color and the various aspects of color to create a strong sense of space through atmospheric perspective. In other words, we're going to look at all of the various ways that color shapes space. To go back to that quote I've given y'all so many times before, this one in particular deals with form and space. That's one reason I want to reiterate it. From Hoffman, it is not the form that dictates the color, but the color that brings out the form. So color helps to create a sense of form. And remember that what Hoffman was advocating was that we not focus on the object, but instead focus on changes of color as light moves across surfaces. That system of using color is one that we call optical color. It's also the same thing as perceptual color. It's based on the way we see color rather than on the inherent physical color of the object. So you can define form as the three-dimensional aspect of shape. We've talked about shape before. If you go back to the first module, we defined shape as any enclosed area in a composition. Form takes that enclosed shape and turns it into something that has the illusion of roundness to it, of three-dimensionality. Those forms are defined by changes in the planes. So as one plane shifts or tilts, it will change color as light moves across it in a different way. What I mean by planes are any flat level or surface that you're observing or that you're trying to create in your painting. And we're going to look at a quick diagram that I made of that so that I think that'll become a little bit clearer. What we've dealt with in talking about blocking in was flat shapes. So we've talked about figuring out where the 3 to 5 values are and the 5 to 7 shapes in creating a thumbnail. Those shapes that we created were flat. They didn't have a sense of form until we worked back into them. So a flat shape is a single plane. So that red square on that gray background is a flat shape. It doesn't have more than one plane to it. If I turn the square onto the corner so that the corner is facing out, then you see intersecting planes. That joining together of planes creates the illusion that there's depth there. You know that if you reach out and touch the screen that you're looking on right now, you're not going to feel the edge of a cube. But I've created the illusion of the edge of a cube by changes in values that are created by how light falls across intersecting planes. So on the left-hand side of that gray rectangle, you have a little yellow circle that's standing for the sun. That sun is the direction of the light. The light is shining on the red face of the square, of that cube. So that red face is super intense and super bright because that's where the light is falling. The color on the opposite side, the adjacent side of the cube, is cooler and darker because it's not being illuminated by the sun. When we're talking about space, you can define space as depth. It can be deep space, it can be shallow space, or it can be flat space. How you choose to deal with space as an artist is completely up to you. So creating a sense of really super deep space might not be what you're interested in, and that's okay. You don't have to do that. You need to figure out how you want to treat space. And you might treat space differently in different paintings. There are times when I'm working with a still life where that space is going to be fairly shallow. And there are times when I'm working with a fairly narrow range of space in a landscape where that space is going to be pretty shallow. But there are also times when I'm trying to create the illusion of very, very, very deep space that goes off into infinity. So we're going to talk about some ways to create that sense of infinite space in just a minute. 3 terms that you need to understand for describing depth are foreground, middle ground, and background. And they mean exactly what they sound like. Foreground is the very front part. Middle ground is halfway between foreground and background background is the most distant space, the furthest thing away from us. When you look at this photograph, I've pointed out on here where those areas are in the composition. So the background is the space that is closest to the horizon, that is the furthest away from the viewer. The foreground is the area that's closest to the viewer. Middle ground is the area that is, if you were looking at it from up in the air like a bird, it's the area that's halfway between foreground and background. But you'll notice something curious on here. You see where I've pointed to the middle ground here on this photograph? If I were to divide the space up, it is way more close to the background if I'm measuring on the photograph than it is to the foreground. That's because of receding space. So it'll look like it's about 2/3 of the way back from the foreground, but if you tilted it up like a map, it would be halfway between the front and the back. There are 2 main ways that you can create that illusion of deep space. The first one's linear perspective, and the second's atmospheric perspective. When I teach linear perspective at the college, I tell students to take Tylenol before and Tylenol afterwards because it's one of those things that tends to make people have a really bad headache. So we're not going to go into super great depth on linear perspective. We could have an entire course around that. It is primarily a drawing issue rather than a painting issue. So to understand linear perspective, that's usually something that's taught in a drawing class. I'm going to give you the 30-second version, though, just so that you'll understand what I'm talking about in case you've never had it before. Linear perspective is a system for creating depth that's based on converging parallel lines. And the classic example of that is a railroad track, standing on a railroad track looking into the distance. Well, since I didn't want to stand on a railroad track, I thought I would stand on this little country road. So it recedes straight back into the distance. Physically, the yellow line on the road and the 2 white lines on the edge are the same distance apart all the way down that road. If it weren't, my car would run off into the fields. But because lines that are parallel appear to converge as they move on closer to the horizon line, if I took a ruler out and measured, those lines appear to get closer together on that photograph. The other thing you'll notice about linear perspective is that vertical lines that are the same height appear to get shorter. So look at those telephone poles on the right-hand side. They're about the same distance apart as when you go from one to the next, and they're all the same height. That one that's in the middle ground right there appears to be about 1/3 again as tall as the next one down, which also appears to be about 1/3 again as tall as the next one. And they start to get closer as well as they get towards the horizon line. All of those things are visual cues that help you get the sense that there's a deep space there, even though you know that's a flat photograph. The system that we use most often in painting, although there is linear perspective in there as well, but the system that's much easier to get, I think, a strong grasp of, and in some ways far more important, is atmospheric perspective. It's also known as aerial perspective at times. I don't like using that phrase because it sounds like you're looking at aerial photographs, and I think people find that confusing. So I call it atmospheric perspective, but you might see it referred to the other way at some point. This photograph is a really good example of the effect of the atmosphere on shapes, surfaces, and colors. And that's what atmospheric perspective is. It's the illusion of depth that's created by changes in the shapes, surfaces, and colors to reflect the effect of atmospheric haze on perception. Especially in the southeast where I live, we have really, really strong perceptions of atmospheric perspective because we've got lots and lots of haze, especially after all the rain. So all those particles in the air get between you and what you're looking at. Those particles cause changes in surface, changes in color, and changes in shape. So we're going to talk about each of those individually, and then we're going to really hone in on how those changes in color affect the way we see things. So atmospheric perspective, again, is created by changes to shape, surface, and color that are the effect of atmospheric particles, whether it's dust or humidity or any of those other things. What happens to those three elements is what creates that strong sense of depth. So look at size. One of the changes that happens in size as you go from foreground to middle ground to background is that shapes appear to get smaller. Another thing that happens is that the complexity of the shapes change. So things that appear very complex and very detailed in the foreground become very simple and very undetailed in the background. So complexity diminishes as you go to the background. The other thing that happens to shapes is something that happens to the edges. So in the foreground, the edges will be crisp and clear. In the background, the edges will be soft and fuzzy, because the further back you go, the more particles there are between you and what you're looking at. So edges go soft as you go to the background. Now that doesn't mean you won't have any soft edges in the foreground. You'll have a range of edge, but you will definitely not have super sharp edges in the background, except where the sky meets the land. That can tend to be a little sharp. Surface is the second element that's really impacted by atmospheric perspective. And the way that surface changes is in some ways similar to shape. The patterns that help us perceive surface, the patterns of light and dark, simplify as you go back into space. And complexity simplifies as you go back into space. And what that means is that surfaces that appear rough in the foreground will appear smooth in the background. So you can have a wide range of surfaces in the foreground from rough to smooth. You will not have rough surfaces in the background, not in the far distance. It will appear almost completely smooth. Color, the thing we're going to focus on the most, has the most changes. So we've already talked about value in the sense that you want to have a wide range of values in your composition. But there's some things that happen to value as you go back into space. One of the main things that happens is that the contrast diminishes. Sometimes you'll hear people say that you go from dark to light or light to dark as you go back into space. Usually they say dark to light. That's an oversimplification, and it's one I've heard a couple of people talking about in the forum or having questions about on Facebook. You do not go just from dark to light as you go back into space. The value doesn't change that simply. It can depend on time of day and the kind of lighting. So it's easier to understand that you have a wide range of values in the foreground and you have a very limited range of values in the background. That covers all lighting situations and all times of day. So if it's daylight, like in this photograph, you're going to have a wide range of values in the foreground. When you go to those trees that are the furthest distance away, you're only going to see one or two values. So the number of values will decrease. If you were looking at that same scene under the light of the moon at night, the same would hold true. You would have a full range of values in the foreground. You'd be able to see differences in values, and you'd see very few, if any, in the background because you would not be able to see those far distant trees. So keep in mind that with value, you have diminishing contrast going from high contrast to low contrast. Hues also change. In the foreground, you'll have many different hues, many different colors. In the background, you're only going to have one or two different colors. So the number will diminish as you go into the background. Intensity has two things that change. Just like value, with intensities, you have a diminishing contrast as you go from the foreground to the background. So if you look at that foreground grass, there are areas that are intense and bright green, and there are areas that are dull green. You go to the background, and you've got one intensity. The second thing that happens to intensity as you move to the background is that the color dulls out. So you're going to get some what really are super dull colors as you go to the background. And you're going to want to emphasize that to create a stronger sense of depth. Fourth aspect of color is temperature. And like intensity, it has two things that change as you go back into space. You have diminishing contrast, which means that you could have both warm and cool colors in the foreground, but you're going to only have either warm or cool in the background, which leads to the second thing that's going to change. Temperature will shift. So the predominant temperature is going to be either warm or cool in the foreground, depending again on the light and the time of day. And it will flip and go to the opposite as you go to the background. So if your foreground is predominantly warm, the background's going to be predominantly cool. If your foreground is predominantly cool, the background is going to be predominantly warm. So it's going to change and shift as you go back into space. So keep in mind that we want to really think about those values, hues, intensities, and temperatures as we go back. Value, you have diminishing contrast from high to low. Hue, diminishing number from many to one or two. Intensity, again, diminishing contrast from high to low. And a dulling of the color as you go back. Temperature, you have diminishing contrast, and you have a shifting from warm to cool or cool to warm. So you're going to have that flipping thing happen between the warmth and the coolness of the color. So to put all of those together in a list, there's 7 things, 7 effects that you can use in rendering atmospheric perspective to achieve a realistic feeling of space using optical color. You're going to have diminishing size of objects as you go back into space. Edges are going to soften. There's going to be diminishing detail or complexity. There's going to be diminishing contrast in value, intensity, and temperature. So you'll have a wide range in the foreground, a very limited range in the background. You're going to have a diminishing number of hues moving from foreground to background. You're going to have dulling of color as you go towards the background. And you're going to have a shifting of temperature. So it'll flip from either warm to cool or cool to warm. So I wanted to look at a painting that was finished right now and just talk about that for a minute. This is a fairly recent painting that I did called Fall Feels Early Evening. And I've played off of those contrasts in warm and cool colors in the foreground to cool colors in the background. And you'll see almost every last one of those shifts and changes that we've talked about happening in this one painting. There's also a little bit of linear perspective in here as well in the rows of the field. So here I've diagrammed it for you. Towards the foreground, you see that I have a wide range of value, a wide range of intensity. So I have some dull colors, some intense colors, some dark colors, some light colors. There's more of a range of surfaces. You can see the roughness of the paint. There's more texture in the paint. In the middle ground, look where those trees are, that circle on the left. In the middle ground, those trees have 2 values, 2 to 3 values. So you do see some contrast with where the light is hitting the trees. There's still a little bit of surface in there. Not a whole lot of detail, but some detail breaking up the space. And there's a little bit of warm, cool color contrast going on as well. Where the light's hitting, that green is a little bit warmer than the sort of blue-green in the shadows. Now look at the circle on the right. That is the background. There's another little tiny bit of background over on the left. Those are the trees that are in the far distance, the things that are furthest away from the viewer's eye and closest to the horizon line. That color back there is both lighter and duller than what we have anywhere else in the composition. And notice that it's gone cooler as well. All of those are visual cues that create a strong sense of depth or space. Look at the sky for a minute as well. So you have some of those same visual cues happening in the sky. It's cooler in the area that's closest to you, which is the top of the composition, the top of the sky, where it's blue. It's warmer down towards the horizon line. You'll also see there's more detail towards that section that's closest to you and less where it's further away. So here's that painting again without the circles on it. Think about incorporating those into your compositions, and you're going to get a super strong sense of space and depth. As you're observing the landscape or observing your subject, this all applies whether you're talking about landscapes, still lifes, figures, portraits. All of them are made up of shifting planes that catch the light in different ways so that you can create a strong sense of space. Begin to incorporate those in, and you're going to be able to achieve that yourself. In the demo, you're going to be able to see me paint a landscape from that photograph I showed you earlier. That's a fairly simple landscape, and in fact, I would strongly recommend that you use that same photograph just because it's super simple. So you're going to be able to concentrate on the very few places where the planes shift, and you're going to be able to concentrate on that diminishing intensity and the temperature shift that happens in there. So what we've covered today are first the definitions of form and space, form being the three-dimensional aspect of shape, and space being the sense of depth. We've gone over an introduction to the concept of atmospheric perspective, which is one of the ways that color shapes space. Hope this has been helpful. Happy painting, everyone.